I am actually a native New Yorker. I grew up in Stuyvesant Town here. My family was somewhat left-wing. One of the things, they were sort of hippies in the 60s, and they took me to Central Park to a place called a Bee Inn, where hippies would go to bee. And one of the things the hippies did, they took out their wallets, they threw it in a garbage can, and they set it on fire to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And I was 5 years old, and I saw the money burning there, so I reached into the fire, grabbed out a $5 bill, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And then then at age 7, I was living in Stuyvesant Town. I decided I wanted to become a writer. I was reading Paddington the Bear stories. And I decided that's what I wanted to do. And I remember in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So that was the second thing that happened to me here. The third thing was I went to Grace Church School on 10th and Broadway, if anybody knows that school down by the Strand bookstore. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir at Grace. We would sing the hymns. We were about half Jewish, half Christian. We'd sing the hymns, but to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. So the volume would drop down, and then we'd come back up. And a lot of things changed since that time, but I do love New York. I'm going to talk about creativity. Creativity is internal tension. What we just heard, a beautiful story, was the tension between comedy and pathos. Picasso took African masks and Western art and jammed them together, created Picasso. T.S. Eliot took tradition and modernism, jammed it together. Steve Jobs took technology culture and 1960s LSD culture and jammed them together. And so when you're talking about creativity and innovation, you're talking about the clash of two things and the confrontation of two things, two galaxies to create a third thing. And the clash that I've been spent the last few years thinking about is a clash between two sets of virtues, which I call the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the things you put on your resume, you bring to the marketplace. Are you good at math? Are you good at Excel? Are you good at accounting? The eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead. Are you honest? Are you courageous? Are you capable of deep love? These are non-overlapping virtues. We would all acknowledge that the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume virtues. But we happen to live in a culture that has us thinking a lot more about the resume virtues than about the eulogy virtues. And there's something fundamentally screwed up about that. Now, the way I think about this problem is a book I read called The Lonely Man of Faith by Joseph Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik takes the two accounts of creation in Genesis and says there are two sides to our nature, to each of us, which he calls Adam 1 and Adam 2. Adam 1 is the resume Adam, the external Adam. Wants to have a success, a great career, win victories, fame, money. Adam 2 is the humble Adam. Adam 2 wants to be enveloped by love, security, and meaning. Adam 2 wants to serve others. Adam wants to not only to do good, but to be good, to have an inner soul that honors God, creation, and one's possibilities. Adam 1 wants to conquer the world. Adam 2 wants to hear a calling and obey something transcendent. Adam 1 savors accomplishments. Adam 2 savors the warmth and love of a family meal. Adam 1 asks how things work. Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth. Adam 2 wants to return home. Adam 1's motto is success. Adam's 2 motto is love, redemption, and return. Soloveitchik argues that we have these two sides of our nature, and they are in conflict with each other, or at least sometimes in tension. Sometimes it's time, matter of time, what are you paying attention to? Sometimes it's a deeper tension. And I'd say the hardest part of that tension is the two Adams live by different logics. Adam 1, the marketplace Adam, lives by the logic of economics, which is straightforward. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward, practice makes perfect. Adam 2 lives by an inverse logic, which is filled with paradoxes, best embodied by the Beatitudes. You have to give to receive. You have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desire to get what you crave. Success leads to the greatest failure, which is pride. Failure leads to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. So we live in an Adam 1 culture, and we struggle to find the balance between those two. And I'm going to talk a little about the bloody crossroads of those tensions between our imaginative moral nature and our practical worldly nature, between career and passion, between reason and inspiration, between discipline and imagination, between creativity and tradition. And some people have created a solution, a temporary solution to that problem. They have a stability. They have a stability between their external success and their internal desire for holiness. They have a stability between what is innovative and new and what is traditional. And the people who have that stability, we say they have virtue, we say they have character. We have a bunch of words we use to describe those people. But we often are not quite sure what we mean by those words. So say the word character. What do we mean when we say somebody, oh, that person has character? The first thing we mean is they have length. They have consistency over time. The things that lead us astray are short-term, lust, fear, vanity, and gluttony. The things we call character are long-term, courage, honesty, humility, service. Nietzsche's phrase, a Peterson book, they have a long obedience in the same direction. The consistency over time is the first thing. Second thing we mean when we say somebody has character is they're firmly attached, they're anchored. They're not free-floating lone wolves. In the realm of the intellect, they have a set of permanent convictions about fundamental things. In the realm of emotions, they have a web of unconditional loves. In the realm of actions, they have permanent commitments to tasks that can't be completed in a lifetime. In the realm of the spirit, they have a devotional faith in God. So they're deeply connected. The third thing we mean when we say someone has character is that there's something solid there. Each of us has a core piece of ourselves. This is C.S. Lewis. That core piece of ourselves is slowly malleable by you. If you make disciplined choices, you build that core piece into something disciplined and coherent. If you make selfish, short-sighted choices, you degrade that core piece. You become inconstant, you become fragmented, your life will fall to pieces. So the people we say have character, have that solidity, they have scope, and they have constancy. But they have those things out of a resolution of tensions between different things, between Adam 1 and Adam 2, between the need for change, the need for stability, the need for passion, and the need for reason. They've created a synthesis. And so what activities get you there? Well, if you see those people, they're not middling, moderate people. They've gone strong in both directions. They're very passionate and very committed to change. At the same time, they're very disciplined and very committed to reason. They've gone to the nth degree in both directions. And they've been engaged in activities which have strengthened them on both sides. If you go to a cathedral, the walls want to collapse in on themselves. They only survive because they're leaning on each other with awesome force. And that's what people with character, they have that kind of stability. So what kind of activities do they have that gives them that stability? First, they have some activities that are what we associate with inspiration, with creativity, with morality, with disruption, with spiritual awakening. The most important of those, of course, is love. It's hard to imagine we'd say someone has character, someone's creative, unless they were capable of deep love. The love I'm talking about was described by a guy named Douglas Hofstadter, who's an Indiana University mathematician. Hofstadter was in sabbatical many years ago with his wife Carol and his 2 kids, who were then 5 and 3, when Carol got a brain aneurysm and died suddenly. Hofstadter kept a photo of Carol on his nightstand, and he looked at that photo probably every day. But one day, a couple months after her passing, he looked at it with a special intensity and wrote the following. I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once, I found myself saying as tears flowed, "That's me, that's me." And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I'd had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher level entity, about the fact that at the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for our children, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that defined us both, that welded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all, but that it had lived on very determinedly in my brain. So the first thing love does is it decenters us. It reminds us that our love, at the core, the riches of our being are not in ourselves, they're in another person. The second thing it does is it humbles us. You can't control when you fall in love, you fall in love. It's like being invading by an army and you welcome the invasion. It eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. When the person you love gives you a gift, you're doing them the biggest favor of giving them the pleasure of giving you that gift. So it drags you down by humbling you, you're not in control, by decentering you, but then it lifts you up because you want to serve the person you love. So you go down and then you come up. Dorothy Day, one of my heroes, worked on the Lower East Side. Her life was a mess until she had children. She had a daughter. And she wrote of that occasion, if I had sculpted the greatest sculpture, painted the greatest painting, written the greatest novel, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. And with that came a need to worship and to adore. She needed somebody to thank for her daughter, and she turned to God and became a Catholic. So it took her down, then love lifted her up. So that's the first thing. The second activity we associate with people with depth of character is attached to love, which is suffering. Now, there's nothing noble about suffering. And when we plan our lives, we plan for happiness, but when we look back on our lives at the things that shape us, they're usually hard times. I've never heard anybody said, my life was really changed because I had a fantastic vacation in Costa Rica. Usually it's the hard moments. And what suffering does, it humbles us too, because you can't control your own brain. You're not in control of your own suffering. It just happens. You can't tell it. You can't turn it off. The second thing suffering does, like love, it drags you deeper into yourself. It's like a plow that opens hard ground. Paul Tillich, the 1950s theologian, said that suffering takes people beneath the busyness of life and reminds them they're not who they thought they were. Tillich's metaphor is that it takes you into what you think is the basement of your soul, and it carves out the floor, and then reveals a cavity below, and then it carves out that floor, reveals another cavity, and another cavity, and another cavity. It brings you down into the valley of humility. But then it also lifts you up. People instinctively want to attach suffering to something transcendent. I have friends who lost their child, Henry, when he was about 6. And they didn't say, we had 2 bad years of grief, we should go to a lot of parties to make up for it. No one says that. They created a foundation called Hope for Henry so that Henry's life would be attached to some act of service for children he didn't know. And so again, took them down and lifts them up. And so those are things that, I think, open up our hearts. But the tension is, then you've got to police it. You've got to have discipline to police the emotions and the opening and the flourishing. And so the third thing that I think someone with character has is the capacity to self-defeat, immense self-control and discipline. Dwight Eisenhower was 9 years old and he wanted to go out trick-or-treating. His mom, this remarkable woman named Ida, said, no, you can't go, you're too young. Eisenhower threw a temper tantrum, punched the tree in his front yard so bad that all the skin was rubbed off his hands and his hands were bloody. Ida sent him to his room, had him cry for an hour, and then came up to bind his wounds, and she recited to him a verse from Proverbs. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And Eisenhower said 8 years later when he wrote his memoirs, that was the most important conversation of my life, because it taught me I had a weakness, I had a sin. And that was my passion, my temper. And he spent the rest of his life combating that. We think of Eisenhower as this avuncular country club kind of guy. That was a total act. He was seething in World War II and during the presidency, seething with anger and hatred and passion. Up nights, insomnia, throat infection, stomach problems, blood pressure spikes. But he knew he could not succeed at his job if he exhibited that, so he fought it. Some of the ways he fought it were trivial. He would take the names of the people he would hate. He would write them on a piece of paper, rip them up, and throw them in the garbage. But it was discipline. And when we look at people, whether they're artists what we see is tremendous capacity for emotion and opening up that hard ground through love and suffering, and then amazing commitment for discipline. I've never met a writer. I don't know too many painters. I know a lot of writers. I never met a writer who didn't have a ritual. 9 to 11, 9 to 11, 3,000 words every day, 3,000 words every day. You just got to discipline that thing. Matthew Arnold said there are two frames of mind. I'm really into dualisms. The Hellenic frame of mind and the Hebraic frame of mind. The Hellenic frame of mind stands for spontaneity of consciousness. Spontaneity of consciousness, seeing the world and being open to it. The Hebraic frame of mind stands for strictness of conscience, knowing what's true and sticking to what's true and what's moral. Those two frames of mind being open and then also being closed. Routines with creativity, emotion captured in reason. I was at a cocktail party a few months ago here in New York, and I was talking to a novelist, and of course we started talking about drinking. And I said, "Can you write and drink at the same time?" He said, "No, I can't." And I said, "Neither can I just can't do it." "You think you're going to be really good? You can't do it." And then I said, "Do you drink after?" And he said, "Yeah, I always have a glass of wine after." And I said, "So do I." And I said, "Why do you have a glass of wine?" And this was a novelist. He said, "It's because emotion, my writing the novels, the fiction, is such an emotional experience, I need the wine to calm me down." And I said to him, "That's funny. My writing of journalism is such a controlled experience, I need the drinking to feel." We both were trying to get that same balance, but coming from different directions. But it is about that tension, the Hellenic and the Hebraic. I want to talk a little about how this looks in practice. In 1709, there was a guy born in Lichfield, England, named Samuel Johnson. Johnson barely survived childbirth. He was given to a nursemaid whose milk infected him with tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, which made him permanently blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, poor vision in the other eye. He later developed smallpox, which left his face permanently scarred. Doctors, in order to cure some of these ailments, opened up his arm to bleed him and kept it open for 6 years, closing it with horsehair. They also cut into his neck glands to expose his thyroid and do something with it. They botched the operation, and they had scars running from jaw to ear on one side of his face. He was large, ugly, misshapen. He also was born, some of us like me are born with not enough imagination. We have to work to get it going. He was born with a vivid imagination. One day when he was 9, he was reading Hamlet in his basement, and he started shrieking at the terror of the ghost and had to run out on the street to remind himself that real life existed. He went to Oxford at age 19 and made a complete mess of it. He didn't go to class. He went sledding instead. He wrote, "I was mad and violent." He wanted to be famous, but he just couldn't buckle under the routine of school. He returned to Lichfield in disgrace, flunking out after a year. He went through a bout of severe depression. He had horrible hypochondria, dejection, gloom, despair, probable suicide attempts. During this period, he developed Tourette's syndrome, trouble controlling his body, rocking back and forth. He made these bizarre whistling sounds. He developed OCD. He would tap his cane. If it wasn't the right number when he entered the room, he had to go back and tap the right number. He ate like a wild animal. It was disgusting to eat with him because he was just spewing food. He tried to become a teacher. Somebody with bizarre tics and bad looks is not going to do well with little boys. He had probably the most unsuccessful school in British history. It closed after a few months. His life up to page 30 had been a steady calamity. He fell to pieces. A German word is Zerrissenheit. The dizziness of freedom. Everything about him was forcible, violent, out of control. His mind was also out of control. We, and a lot of us even here today, think of imagination as a sweet thing, leads to creativity and openness. Johnson did not think that. Johnson thought imagination was something to be as feared as much as treasured. It was at its worst in the middle of the night. I heard Christian Wyman, a good phrase, sometimes we have these middle of the night thoughts. I'm going to botch the exact phrase, but it was something like, The thoughts are like a drawer full of knives. And in the middle of the night, sometimes we have these thoughts. And Johnson was plagued by them, plagued by imagination. He would have ideal visions of what his life can be, and then he'd be disappointed because his life wasn't like that. That was a problem with imagination. He'd look at other people, and then he didn't see measured up. He was envious. That was a problem of imagination. He thought imagination simplifies endless desires, causes fantasies that'll never be fulfilled. As soon as you achieve one thing, your imagination leaps ahead and you can't enjoy what you just achieved. He had a very ambivalent attitude toward imagination, understanding the good as well as the bad. And so here was a guy who could not control his body. He had these jerking motions. He could not control his mind. It was just leaping all over the place. He walked to London with his one pupil that was left, a guy named David Garrick, and he began writing. He went to Grub Street, became a freelance hack writer. He wrote with awesome power. He could write 1,800 words an hour, 12,000 words in a sitting. That's 30 book pages in a sitting. Anybody who writes, that's an awesome amount of writing. And he wrote himself to virtue. His first big achievement, in 1738, the House of Commons passed a law that it was illegal to report on the speeches in the House of Commons. So somebody would come to him and tell him who spoke and in what order, and he just wrote out all the speeches from his head. Here's what they could have said. For the next 200 years, those speeches were appearing in the best speeches in English history, ascribed to the politicians he imagined were giving them. He was a social writer. He did not write alone. He liked to be in bars. He was fear of loneliness because his imagination would run away from him. So he was hanging out all the time and doing pranks. If somebody told him that if you put 3 balls into a gun and if you shoot it, it'll explode, he immediately put 8 balls into the gun and shot into the wall. Somebody told him somebody drowned in a piece of river, he jumped in that piece of river. A lot of his aphorisms look like they're things, they sound like things that he might have said over a bar, just witticisms among his friends. Patriotism, the last refuge of the scoundrel. When a man knows about to be hanged, it concentrates the mind. He was tired of London, is tired of life. It's conversational, like things he just said over a beer. And he just kept writing. And he wrote about morality. He was a guy who was a mess among himself, and so he took everything he feared, everything that worried about himself, and he just grabbed it with both hands and wrote about it and pinned it down. And he was unabashedly moral. He said, like John Stuart Mill, we have a moral responsibility to be better, more moral every single day. As he put it, the happiness of society depends on virtue. A writer's duty is to make the world better. He was an unabashed moralist. He was deeply aware of our own weakness. A lot of his aphorisms have that awareness of how weak we can be. A man of genius is but seldom ruined but by himself. If you are idle, be not solitary. If you are solitary, be not idle. There are people whom one should like to drop, but would not wish to be dropped by. Man's chief merit consists of resisting the impulses of his nature. It's all an awareness. And he took his sins, and he took his sorrows. And some of us have this vague sense, oh, I'm depressed, I feel sorry. Johnson leapt right into it. He wrote a great essay about sorrow. He noticed that all the other passions lead to their own extinction. Hunger leads to eating, lust leads to sex, thirst leads to drinking, but sorrow is the exception. Sorrow doesn't direct you toward its own cure. Sorrow builds on sorrow. Makes this observation. He wrote, sorrow is the state of mind in which our desires are fixed upon the past without looking forward to the future. He wrote, the only antidote to sorrow is work. Sorrow, he wrote, is a kind of rust of the soul which every new idea contributes in its passage to scour away. It is the putrefaction of stagnant life and is remedied by exercise and motion. Just an example of how he would look at the things he was afflicted by and take them on. And slowly, 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 he becomes this amazingly solid person. He's wrestling with all his demons, and over the years, he becomes astoundingly good. First, he works super hard. He writes the first English dictionary. It took 40 French scholars 55 years to write the first French dictionary. It took Johnson, with 6 clerks, 8 years to write the first English dictionary. Amazing level of work. A friend of his tried to design a kind of navigation that wouldn't rely on the stars. He spent 60 years at this task and failed. On his deathbed, he said, "My life has been a failure." So Johnson learned navigation and wrote a book in this guy's name, so at least he would have a book to leave behind. A friend of his got the Blackstone lectureship at Oxford but didn't know any law. So Johnson said, "I'll write some lectures for you." He wrote 60 separate lectures stretching over 1,600 pages for this guy, for free. He had a house where he kept strays. There was a doctor who served the poor who had no money. There was a former slave. There were a lot of former prostitutes. There were orphans. He just kept them all in the house. And he became so solid. At the end of his life, it was one of his biographers has a great phrase, "Iron entered the soul." From a guy who was so fragmented, by age 50 and 60, he was so solid, and everybody knew they were in the presence of a great man. At the end of his life, his dad, who he had not been kind to in his misspent youth, he thought about him. He was dead by now. But he remembered a time when his dad, who was a bookseller, asked him to go out stand in the market stall. And Johnson didn't want to, because he was embarrassed by his dad. So at the very, very end of his life, he went to the town where he had said no, and he stood on the spot of the stall. And he just stood there for a day. He wrote, "Pride was the source of my earlier refusal, and the remembrance of it was painful. A few years ago, I decided to atone for this fault. I went to Exeter, the town, in very bad weather, and I stood for a very considerable time bareheaded in the rain. In contrition I stood. I hoped that my penance was expiatory." Adam Gopnik had a piece in the New Yorker with a good sentence. He was his own whale, and he brought him home. And he became just such an impressive man. Turned his handicaps into advantages, took the imagination which had been running away, and he disciplined it. Took the moral passion, and he gave it structure through thought. When he died, Gerard Hamilton, a friend of his, said, "He has made a chasm which not only nothing can fill up, but which nothing has a tendency to fill up. Johnson is dead, let us go with the next best. There is nobody. No man can be said to put you in mind of Johnson." And so I hold that example up because while the imagination has some bad features, it has some phenomenal features too, and especially the moral imagination. When we see somebody like Johnson or somebody like Dorothy Day, the imagination leaps upward and inspires us to try to be better people and to try to achieve the reconciliation between opposite tensions that they experienced. And Johnson never really experienced that moment of tranquility that we all hope for when the freedom and the discipline come together, when Adam 1 and Adam 2, the eulogy and the resume come together. But occasionally you meet a hero for whom that does come together. If you read, I hope everybody here has read the Confessions. There's a moment when Augustine is sitting with his mom, Monica, the helicopter mom of all helicopter moms. And it's at the end of her life, and she said, "All my life I wanted you to be a Christian. You've become a Christian. I'm ready to meet the Lord." And he describes the conversation of how their voices sweetly mingle together. And then he has a long sentence that's very hard to parse. And it's got the word hushed in it. The sound of the birds were hushed. The sound of the wind was hushed. The sound of our voices were hushed. And everything was hushed. And in that silence, you feel the tranquility as all the tensions of their relationship ease into tranquility. Dorothy Day, who I mentioned earlier, at the end of her life, she was going to write her memoirs. She sat down with a piece of paper, and she wrote "A Life Remembered" on the top of the paper. And she's going to write her memoir. She was a great writer. And so she sat there for a few minutes, and she thought, how do I tell this story? And she thought, here's what she said about that. "I thought of the Lord and his visit to us all those centuries ago, and I was just grateful to have had him on my mind all this time." And with that sentiment, she realized she didn't need to write the memoirs. She was just grateful. And when we have all these tensions of Adam 1, Adam 2, eulogy, resume, creativity, and discipline, they all finally get resolved in gratitude. So thanks very much.